Yeah, so welcome today for a new session, Markenattraktivität für Familienunternehmen. Why do I talk today in English? Because my special guest today is Dan Norenberg. He is the expert for executive ownership. Dan, welcome.
Good morning, Karsten, and it's a pleasure to be with you on your show today.
I'm so proud to have you here because we have a long-lasting relationship already, and I'm glad that you are in this, let's say, video format today, and we talk about a bit about leadership, about executive leadership, about leadership for teams, and especially your brand positioning, the ownership. So what does it mean? What does executive ownership mean, Dan?
Well, let me say, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. My business, my mission, my passion is to improve leadership performance and organizational results through a process called executive ownership. And if we look historically, we know that the majority of consultants and organizations develop people individually as individual leaders. And I've for a long time felt that leadership is a team endeavor. And this is the whole nature of what executive ownership means. It means leadership change and development should start at the top. It should always start in the team, and it should be involved around real business issues so people can take ownership of the changes they need to make and lead others in that way. So that's what it's about.
That's great. We met the first time at Fujitsu Siemens, and you were my business coach, let's say so. And yeah, it was more or less somehow individually, somehow in a group, but you have made a huge progress in getting, let's say, strong teams from big companies. Usually we talk about family businesses, but you are playing in another league, and which is why I'm glad to have you here. So how does it work, and what kind of challenges are you facing when you are called in these teams?
Well, let me just, if I can, let me give a little bit of historical background first to maybe make the setting. And we did meet at Fujitsu Siemens, and like and that's a very large organization, or it was at the time, and it's still a large organization. But I work with organizations from between 10 million and 10 billion. Yeah. And at the time that we met, I was the managing director and founder of a leadership consultancy with 12 consultants. And we were doing talent development, and of which you were a top talent, and talent management, global team building, communication training, and things like that. And from time to time, these global corporations, sometimes mittelständische Firma, they would ask me, they'd come to me and say, hey, you're working with the middle part of our organization, but our senior leadership team is having some difficulties. And we've seen your style, would you mind talking to them and seeing if you could help them? And I said, well, I'd be happy to. So that was my first step into the really executive suite when I moved in and started working with executive teams. And what I saw, and now I've worked with over 150 leadership teams on 3 different continents, what I've seen is that at the executive level, at the senior leadership team, these people are extremely intelligent. They're very ambitious. They're very hardworking, but tragically, they don't really work as a team. And over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, I've developed a methodology, which I call executive ownership, which helps leadership teams to improve the way they work together, the way they work with their organization, the way they work with their strategy, and that in turn creates a shift in the whole organization. So that's a little bit about the background.
So when we talk about senior leaderships, that means that, would you say that most of the companies you probably know don't have that, let's say, senior leadership as a team? Or would you say, well, depends on who it is, but most of the companies don't work as a team on a senior leadership level?
Yeah, well, I mean, across the world, let's just look at it this way. We've got about 50 million businesses across the world with 100 million euro turnover and more. And so they all have, let's say, an executive team in name, and they also have strategic leadership teams that support them. Supply chain management, sales, marketing, manufacture, R&D, and things like that. So they all have this name, executive team or strategic team, but there are some things that get in the way and really prevent them from working at their best. Number one I don't care what industry or what business that you're in, at the very senior level, these people have issues coming at them all the time.
Yeah.
So they're very, very busy, and it's very easy for them to jump in and firefight and solve problems and not work on their own issues. Number two, there's also a lot of power at the senior level. So people don't like to show where they're struggling. They don't like to say where they have a problem. And if you can't tell your leadership colleague where you're struggling, how can the team help you? So it becomes just a series of a lot of individuals. And those are some of the things that really block people. And thirdly, sometimes at the senior leadership level, they simply think they're too busy, or they've had enough learning and development, and it should start at the lower levels. Well, I'm a firm believer that leadership development and growth starts at the top. Change starts at the top. People don't do what we say. People do what they see us do, and that's got to start at the senior level.
Would you say that, let's say, at the time being, it is more needed to work as a team, especially on a senior leadership level, than it has been before?
Well, yes, and this is part of what we've seen. I mean, we see two things. I mean, for many, many years, for 3 or 4 decades, we've carried this belief that there was this heroic leader that was going to save the day, one very strong leader. But the speed of change, globalization, the degree of specialization, technology, really mean that no one single man or woman should be expected to run things, completely on their own, like it might have worked 20 years ago, or 30 years, or even 40 years ago. And to even touch on a very sensitive subject right now, and I just want to acknowledge that I know a lot of our viewers are, maybe in difficulty or painful situation due to the corona crisis, or maybe the loved ones around them, and I want to be very sensitive to that.
Yeah.
But if we look at, how leadership has shown up in this corona, we see different aspects of leadership in different regions of the world. And I simply ask myself, if I could just wave a magic wand and ask someone to say, well, let's use an executive ownership process where the global leaders came together for a forum, almost like a global team, a global pandemic team, I'm sure that we'd be in a far better shape than we are now. And that's what I'm being sensitive about that. I don't want to criticize leaders because they have a lot of stuff going on right now, but there is no question that the team construct, that I use and implement offers huge advantages over the individual leader.
Last week, it was recently said by the CEO of Lufthansa, Karsten Klepper. He said, so they don't want to increase the number of board members, so they want to stick to the number they have. However, they want to work more as a team. When I read this article, I felt like, okay, very good approach, great stuff, great business for Dan. However, Lufthansa, from my understanding, is still a German company. They are not that flexible right now. Maybe they have to. What would your advice for them if they, let's say, would drive the right path through this actually jungle they have?
Yeah. Well, first, let me say that, there are certain industries that have remained untouched, some that have actually grown in this particular time, some that have been able to adjust to virtual learning, such as like an Allianz or financial services. But a company like the Lufthansa, which is really a top European and global brand, I would say, has been massively impacted by this. So, and I would also say that in my view, I think that Lufthansa has done a good job of being very professional and transparent and contacting a lot of their stakeholders. So I think that's very good. So, simply my advice would be is that I would strongly suggest that if the board at Lufthansa isn't using someone outside, simply as an outside member, of the management team to help hold them accountable to the things that they've identified are clear for their success route, and to help them focus on that. That would be my one single piece of advice at this point. So this idea of having a sparring partner or someone who's not in the leadership team, who's not politically or economically connected to what's happening in the business, can be a very powerful sparring partner. And I've worked in a variety of industries, from aerospace to aeronautics to pharmaceuticals, and just have seen the benefit that leaders tell me of just having someone who's a little bit outside the business to serve as a sparring partner and hold them accountable for the things that they say are important.
So would you say, I'm just asking, you would be the right one to help them to go the right way?
Well, that's hard to say. I think there's a couple of let's say human elements as well.
Yeah.
I have had experience with over 150 leadership teams and
Wow.
two or three dozen CEOs who have provided very strong references to the work I do. So, I'd like to think that I know what I do. I do feel that I'm an expert in the area of supporting leadership teams. But at the end of the game, it's also a very personal business. So it would be very important. I think we say in German that, the Lufthansa team or the Lufthansa CEO would need to smell me out to see if he felt that he could trust me to serve his interests and the interests of the team. So the most important thing in any kind of advisory relationship or any kind of coaching or consulting relationship with the client is, is there a good match? Is there a good chemistry between someone like me and someone like, the management team? And so what is the quality of that relationship? If that quality of the relationship is there, then they can really move mountains. I mean, I think I have a certain advantage in some ways. I was, as Bruce Springsteen said, I was born in the USA, but I was also made in Germany. So I've spent about half my life in the US and half my life in Germany. So I do have that international aspect, but I do understand, let's say, how the Germans tick.
Yeah.
If you want to say that. But then again, I'm not everything for everybody.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, most of the consultancy is based on trust. That's for sure. And I fully understand that they have to trust you. Well, in case they don't know that much about you right now, so I have heard you brought out a book where mainly stuff of what you are an expert in is in there. What is the name of the book and where can we buy that?
Well, of course, even in my home office, I have a nice handy copy of my recent
cool.
called Executive Ownership, which I was very proud and pleased to partner with Springer Publishing on this book.
Yeah.
And for a number of years, I gathered a lot of experiences about what must go right and what can go wrong in leadership teams. But I didn't want to write it like an academic business book. I wanted to write it. It's, as you can see, I've tried to keep it compact so that you could put that in your briefcase and put it in your car, or you could give it to your management team or to your entire leadership culture if you wanted to.
Yeah.
I tried to put this book in such a way that it describes certain stories and processes and tools about what must go right, what can go wrong for leadership teams that are, that really need to play at their best. And so it's available at Springer Publishing. You can also order it on Amazon, either in a digital version or a hard copy version, or I think it's available also on Barnes & Noble and Hugendubel and a number of others. It's just recently been released.
Cool. I do remember a phrase that starts with a dog. I can't remember the exactly phrase anymore. Then what was it with a dog?
Well, it's sort of a little bit of a humor story. It may be a story that people remember, but it's let me just back up a second. So you may be familiar with a guy who goes into a hotel and he wants to check into the hotel, and the guy checks him into the hotel, and he sees a little dog standing over in the corner, and the man walks over and he turns to the clerk and he says, "Does your dog bite?" And the clerk says no, and the man reaches down to touch the dog, and the dog literally about takes his hand off, and the man, is really freaking out and says, "I thought you said your dog doesn't bite." And the clerk said, "It's not my dog." Now, that's kind of a humorous story, and maybe some people have heard that or seen that in a different context.
Yeah.
But it really points out one of the fundamental principles of executive ownership. There's a lot of examples of "it's not my dog" in companies today. Only 30% of the people say that they're highly engaged. Only 10% of strategy is actually implemented successfully. So a lot of companies are struggling even pre-corona. So, my belief is that clerk, he was responsible. He checked the guy in. He was also accountable to other things that are responsible for hotel clerking, but he didn't take ownership. for the customer experience. Because if you take an ownership, you never will let that guy pet the dog.
Yeah.
So this is what my mission is. My mission is to help men and women who call themselves a leadership team to really hold themselves accountable for their learning, both individually and collectively, so that they set the example for the rest of the people in the organization. I find this extremely inspiring. It always led me to be at my best when I knew leadership teams that I worked for were struggling to be at their best.
It can be, let's say, the final sentences from you, but I want to have one or two clear messages from you in context to your business, to the owner of whatever family business, large companies, smaller companies. What would be your advice for the time being right now?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question. There's a lot that's being said and written about how to deal with the current Corona COVID-19 situation right now. So there's a lot of stuff out there. And I think one thing that I'm good at is helping people, curate and consolidate down to a few basic things. So, I mean, first and foremost, and these are going to sound somewhat simple, but just because it's simple doesn't mean it's easy to do. And so I think it's really important, for a senior leader, either of a family-run business or a major corporation, to be as visible as possible. People need to see or hear from you now. That could be either digitally or face-to-face.
Yeah.
So this idea of being visible is very important. The second of all, as a business leader, obviously usually your number one priority is to make sure that the business operates in a profitable way. Right now, that's got to take a little bit of a sidestep. You've got to make sure that people feel safe and secure, to be able to go almost an empathetic overdrive, to be able to show a high degree of attention to people's health and safety and their families and their loved ones around them, and that their home working environment is something that's suitable. I think that's also important. And I think many of the companies that I'm working right now, I'm supporting right now a couple of dozen different leadership teams, primarily in a virtual setting right now, advisory or in direct coaching, but that, revising that current business plan, how are we adapting that business plan to focus on what's really essential to come through this situation. And I would say last but not least is, how do we transition for growth? What happens as we come out? How do we return to a growth plan, which may look somewhat different than it did going into Corona?
Dan, thank you very much for your great speech. I was so proud to have you here. You are right now in Munich, not in the States, right?
I have a daughter that's in Los Angeles, where I used to live, but we're in Munich with my wife and our oldest son, and doing our best to follow the social distancing and do our part so that we can come out of this successfully.
Thank you very much, Dan. Stay healthy and bleib gesund und vielen Dank, dass du da warst. Thank you.
Danke, Karsten. Es hat mich gefreut. Tschüss.
Ciao.
Ciao.